Hi, welcome to Niche Crafts. Today I'm going to be making some realistic forest terrain with a secret. Making terrain is really fun and can really elevate your gaming experience, but game boards can take up a lot of space. But you're in luck. I've created the ultimate storage solution that optimizes whimsy and aesthetics so you can hide your nerdy little secrets all over your house. I've been a professional oil painter for the last 7 years, and I've been really looking for an opportunity to combine my love of painting with my love of gaming. And then it hit me. Game board painting. Painting game board. Imagine you're playing a game of D&D and your DM points to a painting on the wall that perfectly represents your environment. You're fully immersed. Your character hears a noise. You roll for initiative. Suddenly the DM reaches for the painting, pulls it off the wall, and suddenly you're in the frickin' painting. Did you ever play Super Mario 64 where Mario would jump through a painting into the levels? Well, this idea reminded me of that, and I wanted to see if I could achieve that effect with some terrain. Hanging your terrain on the wall, hidden from view, is a great storage solution, even if you're not a painter. And if you're not, there are a lot of creative things that you can do to deal with the front face of this technique. You could print out your favorite artwork or photograph and paste that on the front as well. This technique is great for anyone. So, let's make the thing. First thing you're going to need to do is buy some materials. Now I'm using a canvas board, which means instead of canvas, it's a hard wood. This is mostly because it's going to be sturdier and easier to build on top of. Now canvases can be pretty expensive, especially if you're buying them new and if you're buying them quite large. But there are lots of ways that you can get cheap canvases. Facebook Marketplace, thrift stores will have a lot of cheap art, or you might be able to find one on the side of the road if you're lucky. Now I wanted to use what they call gallery style canvases, which means that the width of them is a little bit bigger, which means that I had more depth to play with my terrain. If you have the means, you could easily build the frame yourself and put some masonite on top and achieve the same effect for half the price. Unfortunately, I don't have a workshop, so I had to buy mine new, which really hurt. But because of that, we're going to try and do the rest of this project as cheaply as possible, using mostly materials that I found at the dollar store. So I started out with foam board from the dollar store, creating a kind of topographical map, creating some different levels for my terrain while making sure I kept the whole thing really playable. A mistake I commonly make is that I focus too hard on aesthetics and it looking natural, and I sacrifice playability. So my focus for this board was to maximize playability while keeping as much of the aesthetics as I could. Now I've seen a lot of forest terrain and most of them have a river running through them, but the rivers I've seen in my life all have this kind of cascading little waterfall effect. So I wanted to achieve that with the foam board. I planned this whole thing out beforehand, but I still had to do a lot of big brain thinking to cut out the foam board correctly. I glued all those pieces together with some PVA glue, and then I was ready for my first goop. This goop is a combination of Mod Podge, baking soda, paint, and a little bit of fine rock. I wanted to create a little bit of texture every time I added a layer. The Mod Podge is going to seal this whole thing and make a good layer to work on top of. Now it's time to add some Rockies. I got these plaster molds for very cheap, so I used those throughout the build to kind of show some organic transition in the terrain, but you could easily use bark for this or just skip this step entirely. It's not completely necessary, it just adds to the realism of this build. If you go into an actual forest, what you'll find is that there's very little grass. What there actually is a bunch of detritus, fallen leaves, twigs, and dirt. So, to create realistic forest terrain, you want to have a mostly brown map with pops of green, moss and grass and plants all over the place. To achieve that effect, I started with some dirt. Nothing's gonna look more like dirt than dirt. Then, to create some crunchy leaves, I added some paint to some different herbs that I got at the dollar store. Parsley is great for this because it already looks like little leaves. I made a bunch of different colors to look like the different colors of autumn leaves. Then I added those leaves on top of my dirt layer and sprinkled in a little bit of tea. This thing smelled crazy. Miscast just released a video about making your own flock, so I used that technique to add some flock, mostly around the river edge and wherever there are rocks. To mix things up and make some different colors and textures, I finally chopped some dried moss and added a bit of static grass as well. I wanted the board to look good on its own, but I also knew I was going to be adding a lot of mossy scatter terrain, so I wanted the whole thing to look pretty neutral. A while ago, I made these scatter terrain trees out of wire and hot glue. They look fine, but they have a few major issues. The first issue is that they are really tippy. They fall over if you just breathe on them. We'll solve that problem later. But the second problem is that they're really, really boring to look at. They have no character at all. So what I did was I just bent them up and I made them much more gnarled, and then I went in and I added a bunch more branches to give them a bit more character. I want these to feel like a spooky forest. Johnny Fraser Allen showcased his terrain on Tested, and that really inspired this build, and inspired me to sculpt some faces onto my trees. This one is also inspired by
the ugliest tree in the world.
Now that these trees are looking Goblands approved, I can solve the tippy problem. I saw Rachel Does Wonders used magnets for the same effect, so I decided to try that out. I simply punched a hole for where the magnets would go and glued them in place. The magnets came out a couple times and I had to re-glue them, and I'm sure there's a better way to do this, but the magnets aren't strong enough to work with a layer between them, so for now this is going to work, and it does fully solve the tippy problem. I saved the river for last because I needed everything else to be dry. I started by painting the riverbed with blues, greens, and browns because I knew that the water effect was going to be slightly transparent. I didn't really want to deal with a resin pour, and I've seen other people use clear silicone as a water effect, so I tried that. This is my first time using this material, and it worked great. I don't have a caulking gun, so I just had to take off the back and scoop it out with my fingers and slap it onto the map. This was really satisfying, and I did get the effect I wanted, but the silicone did start to set after about half an hour, so after that time I stopped because I didn't want to ruin it. I let that set for a bit, and then I went in with some watered down modeling paste to create some white caps for the waterfall effects and the more aggressive shifting parts of the river. This really sold the effect. Now with that, the terrain is done and it's time to move on to the painting. Now I really wanted that Super Mario effect where the painting represents the terrain, so to achieve that effect, I took some photos of the terrain to use as reference for the painting. Obviously that photo alone is not enough to create a realistic woodland scene, which is what I wanted, so I bashed together a couple of photos to use as the background, and that all together is what I used as a reference to paint my painting. Now I'm specifically an oil painter, so I decided to stick with oil paints for this project because for me, I was going to get a better result and it was going to be a lot faster. But I think acrylics make more sense for this project because they dry a lot faster. I'm going to have to wait a couple weeks for the paint to dry to use this game board as intended, but I think the painting itself is going to look much nicer on the wall because I used oil paints. Obviously you don't have to learn how to oil paint for this project. Use acrylics if you're used to painting with acrylics. I started by sketching out my painting. I always use a grid when I'm sketching because it makes this step take a lot less time. Don't let anyone tell you that you can't use a grid while painting. Then I did my first pass of color, trying to fill the whole canvas before refining any of the details. Next I started by refining the details, starting at the background and working towards the foreground. Now because my reference was a little rough, I had to go back in and fix up some details to make the forest make sense. And then to finish off the painting, I went in with some dark colors, some bright colors, and some highlights to make some areas pop. Now, people often ask me, how do you know when you're finished a painting? And my method is, if I touch a painting for an hour and no one would be able to tell the difference in that work, then I'm done. You can play with a painting forever, but at a certain point, no one's going to notice the difference, or worst case scenario, you might make it worse. So if I spend more time staring at a painting than I do actually touching it, then I know I'm pretty much done. All right, now's the moment of truth. Let's see if it was worth it. But wait, there's more. I made this diorama a long time ago and it was intended to be a game board, but it wasn't quite big enough. So I modified it to be a piece of scatter terrain that can fit nicely on this board. If you want to see how I made this, check out the video. I also took the pond from that build and turned that into a piece of scatter terrain. But wait, there's more! As I was trying out all this terrain, I got to wondering what else could fit on it. Then I thought, my first video, the old grist mill from over the garden wall, what if that fit on this game board? And it fits perfectly. The fall theming, the river, the size, everything works perfectly. And now this is also a piece of playable terrain. You can also go back and watch my very first video. There's a very fun surprise at the end. Most of the combat I run in D&D takes place in the wilderness, and now I've got some awesome terrain for it. Also, these things that I worked really hard on are now usable as terrain. This project is amazing. I am so stoked about it. This idea could easily be used to create some mountainous terrain, some underground terrain, some dungeon tiles. The possibilities are endless, and if you're like me and you like dipping your toes in different creative pursuits, I recommend trying it out. And if you do make it, please send me the pictures on Instagram. If you liked the video, subscribe, and if you'd like to see me make more videos like this, please consider supporting me on Patreon. Joining at the lowest tier means that I can afford to buy materials to create more crazy projects like this, and it just really means the world to me. That's all for now. As always, let me know what you'd like to see me make next time. We got more exciting goblins on the way.